Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is April Wepler, and I am the Engagement Coordinator at the Canadian Environmental Law Association, or CELA. So today's webinar is the third in a series of webinars looking at air quality issues in Aamjiwnaang First Nation. And in this session, we'll be talking about what tools are available to report your environmental concerns and also why reporting is important. I'll start off with a land acknowledgement. I live in Guelph on the banks of the Speed River, and we're on the territory lands of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. And I reside in the Between the Lakes Treaty 3 lands of Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation and also close neighbors of Six Nations of the Grand. If we can advance to the next slide, Zoe. Thank you. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because if you've joined us for the first two webinars, you've already been introduced to us, but I'll just remind everyone that CELA is a public interest law clinic dedicated to environmental equity, justice, and health. Next slide. And then the foundation, as we mentioned in the past, is the charitable arm of the Canadian Environmental Law Association. Lots of great resources on the foundation website. Next slide. So I'm joined today on the line by a number of my colleagues at CELA. So I've already mentioned Zoe St. Pierre, who is CELA's articling student. We also have Teresa McClenahan, who is CELA's executive director, and you'll be hearing from her in a few moments. Also on the line is Faye DeLeon, who is a researcher and paralegal at CELA, and Jackie Wilson, who is a staff lawyer at CELA. And then we planned this series of webinars alongside Matt Stone, who is a hybrid staff lawyer with Indigenous Legal Services for Legal Aid Ontario, and Jeff Plain, who is a community legal worker with Community Legal Assistance Sarnia. I think I've caught all of the panelists that we have with us today. So as I mentioned, this is the third in a series of webinars. The first two were recorded last week and the week before. Those are up on our website and are available for viewing, as well as the slide decks from those presentations. And then we will be hosting an in-person session in Aamjiwnaang at the Community Center on May 30th. So you can watch our website for more information about that, and we'll also share those details, excuse me, via email. That session is intended for community members of Aamjiwnaang. And then a little bit of housekeeping. We are hosting today on Zoom webinar, so you'll notice that your mics and your cameras are off. We would ask that you ask any questions you might have in the Q&A box. We'll see how many attendees we get. I might open up the chat at the end so we can have a little bit more interaction because we do have some sort of questions and discussion topics that we want to get into with you. We are recording today's session and we'll post the recording on our website. We are just going to record the presentation portion and then we'll stop the recording and have some time for discussion afterwards. I think those are all the housekeeping things I need to mention. And so I will now pass the microphone over to Teresa to talk a bit about how CELA can help before we get into our presentations today.
Okay, next slide. No, I guess I'm still doing introductions. Yeah, so CELA as an Ontario legal aid funded clinic and not-for-profit with a real focus on how communities are impacted by environmental issues, can assist with representing qualifying client groups or individuals. We also work on public legal education, and we also work on advancing the law so that it better protects communities from environmental impacts. And in that sense, we also work on things like public participation, influencing the decisions that affect your environment. Next slide. So the agenda today is to talk about the value of reporting if there is a spill to air or an unusual process going on, impact in the area. What are some of the local reporting options? What are some proactive opportunities to influence the future requirements around the petrochemical facilities in the Sarnia area? And a little bit about the alerting system. Next slide. So first of all, we'll talk more about this at the end, but what is the value of reporting? Why does it matter? It matters quite a bit because a lot of the time when governments who allow facilities to emit pollution to air are considering whether to do so in the future or whether to change those requirements, they're paying attention to the past record of that facility. One of the issues they look at is, has it been operating well, or has it been causing an impact on the community? One of the ways to know if it's causing an impact is because they're hearing from the community, or the facility is reporting that they're hearing from the community about impacts. And in addition, there also is tracking about other things going on at the same time. So the facilities are required to keep track of weather conditions, for example, while they're operating, and what they're recording in their own monitoring, and looking at those in the same time frame as hearing from community members. And of course, it's something that can be a question about whether it's making a difference, especially if there doesn't seem to be an immediate impact. But as we'll discuss today, and especially at the end as we get into the discussion, we would encourage people to kind of acknowledge it. It might seem like it's not making the biggest difference in the world right away, but we think it really is important to think about reporting if the conditions merit that. Next slide. So we're going to go through a few places that if there is something in the area, odor or observation of events, or seeing some kind of visible pollution event, or feeling an impact like getting a headache or having trouble breathing, there are a number of ways to report. And what would those be? So the first one we'll talk about is the one that applies province-wide to all kinds of spills. We call them spills to land, spills to water, spills to air. And this can be done through the Ministry of the Environment pollution reporting form online, or by phoning them, and we'll provide both of those. So we've given the link to get into the online reporting form here. If we go to the next slide. And if you do that, then it's a pretty simple form. It will tell you to insert the date, where you noticed that event, what you think or observe the source of the pollution is, as far as you can tell, and what issues you are reporting or observing. And you would click all of those that apply, like odor, noise, smoke, dust, illegal waste, and so forth. Next slide. And you also can phone the Spills Action Center. It's staffed 24/7. This does include reporting spills to air, and so the number is there, 1-866-663-8477, or the Sarnia District Office is also noted, 519-336-4030. Next slide. There's also a pollution reporter app that's been developed. It's a free app. It provides information on some of the local polluters, facilities, chemicals that are being emitted, and a way to report pollution. And then it links into some of the other systems. And that website is noted on the slide, landandrefinery.org/pollution reporter. Next slide. And if you go there, you'll see screens that look like this, and it's providing some information about linking the health effects, the sources of the pollution, and options for reporting. Next slide. And there are icons that allow you as the user to search for a particular polluter, a chemical, find out about health symptoms, and to directly report a concern to the Ontario Ministry of the Environment. Next slide. And there's another way to get into that same form that I just showed you at the Ministry of the Environment, and to report what's happening and where it's happening. Next slide. And there are two ways to use that particular app. One is to find out about the pollution in an accessible way from refineries and other industrial facilities in the area, and connections to research on known health harms. And the second purpose of the app is to use the pollution reporter, as I mentioned, to report the pollution event to the Ministry of the Environment, making it easier to do so. And then it's also sent back as if it's from your own email, and it allows you to keep a record of your report and to share on social media. And those are both also important to again, encourage other community members, if they're noticing anything, to also speak up. And keeping a record of reports is actually quite important as well, so that down the road, if you're having a discussion, if you're part of a discussion with the facilities or the ministry, or you're making a submission about a future proposal for a change to the allowed emissions, you can talk about the numbers of times you've reported seeing adverse events specifically. Next slide. And there's intentionally a translation element to sort of make some of the information and health effects and impacts accessible using peer-reviewed data. And it's also clear that the reporter does not collect data about its users, and you are in control of the reports to the ministry. The next slide. There are other resources that have been developed. The Sarnia Area Environmental Health Project provides information and access to on the website near or close to real-time data from the Sarnia Air Monitoring Network. I showed that in a previous webinar. That's www.cleanairsarniaandarea.com. And there's also information on the Aamjiwnaang First Nation website where you can access the monthly ambient air monitoring report. And that's on the First Nations website with the link shown there. Next slide. So now I want to talk in addition about what are some proactive opportunities to impact future requests by industry about their air emissions. You might remember that last time or the first time we said there are no specific site-specific risk assessments that have been requested for the facilities in Sarnia. This is partly because some of them are under technical standards for air pollution, but there could be in the future. And we are starting to see more and more facilities ask for site-specific risk assessments. And I won't repeat today what those are for and why companies might want that, because that's in our first webinar. But nevertheless, how you might respond to those notices if you see them is something we want to cover today. And then the second type of kind of deviation, if I can call that, from the normal regulation on air standards is technical standards for air pollution. And we covered that as well in one of the previous webinars in this series. But again, today we want to talk about how you can potentially influence when those technical standards are up for review, which they are for this sector in 2023. Next slide. So first of all, on site-specific air standards, so these are a deviation from what the regulation that would apply to air emissions for polluting facilities. And so if a company has not had an environmental approval in the past that deviates from Regulation 419, they can ask for it. And when they initially ask for it, there's a notice on the Environmental Bill of Rights website. The decision maker at the Ministry of the Environment is obligated to take account of the public comments. So we'll give you an example because there hasn't been one recently at Sarnia of one that we did a webinar about last year at the Lennox Generating Station near Bath, Ontario. Next slide. So here's a typical example if you go on to the Environmental Registry of Ontario of what such a request would look like. It gives the name of the proponent and what is the type of approval they're looking for, which is called an instrument. So they're looking for an approval of a site-specific air standard. And they give a timeline for commenting and a bit of a summary of what they're asking for. In that case, they were asking for site-specific standards for sulfur dioxide, nitrogen oxide, and sulfuric acid, and the time frame. The next slide. So using the Environmental Registry, you have rights under the Environmental Bill of Rights. You have the right to have your comments taken into account by the decision maker, in this case, the Ministry of Environment and Climate Change. You have the right to the notice of the decision when they actually make the decision and to say why they made it and how they took any comments into account. And you have the right to appeal if you've commented on the ministry's decision on that type of proposal. At least for most types of postings. And then other people with an interest in the proposal could seek leave to appeal. And if you commented, that's deemed to be evidence of your interest in the proposal. You also have a right to know about leaves to appeal that others might have asked in respect of that facility. Next slide. And this is what the environmental registry as a whole looks like. And you can go in, obviously it doesn't have our banner on the bottom, but the part in the middle there, you can go into the registry, you can search it. If you want to go in every week and just look for things that are recent, or if you want to go in, you can look on a map or look on the names of the facilities near you. There are a number of ways to look for those different types of postings that might interest you. Next slide. And then if you want to provide comments, excuse me, there's a submit a comment button on the proposal itself, and you can submit your comment through that link. And then background documents and further explanations are also on the registry in the same place where the posting is. And there are other ways to submit comments, such as by regular mail or by email. Next slide. And what might you want to comment on? Don't think you need to be an air toxicologist in order to provide comments. If you're a neighbor, if you're in the area, that gives you a right to comment and a right to raise questions and probe a bit to make sure that issues are being considered thoroughly. These items that are on this slide come from the guideline for applicants that the Ministry of the Environment has posted. So these are very relevant topics for you to submit comments about, because these are the kinds of things the ministry is going to be thinking about when it considers whether to grant the site-specific standard to the facility. So they're supposed to be thinking about whether the standards are set at concentrations that are protective against adverse effects. So for example, if they're asking for a site-specific standard similar to what they're already emitting and you've been experiencing adverse effects, you can say that will not be protective against adverse effects because it isn't yet, and therefore it needs to be much more stringent. It's supposed to consider limiting exposure to substances that can affect human health and the environment, as well as require public transparency. So you can talk about things about how easy it is for you to get information. If you've been in touch with the facility, how forthcoming are they about what's going on? If you ask them directly for information, are they giving you the information readily? And then they also talk about technical and economic feasibility. So for example, if you know that the facility has better technology in another geographic location for the same kind of operation, you can legitimately say, why are not they putting that in place here instead of asking for a site-specific standard? Then are they keeping stakeholders informed? Because again, this is among the things the ministry is supposed to be considering, is whether the public and stakeholders are being made aware of the issues of potential incremental health and environmental risks with that site-specific standard. And do they have a plan to get away from the site-specific standard and back to the normal standard? Next slide. And I already talked about the need for an action plan. So are you seeing evidence that they are actually going to be improving over time? Are they investing in the plant? Are they changing their process, changing the chemicals they use, or doing other things that will clearly reduce the impacts from the facility? In terms of reevaluating the standards that have been granted, are we seeing them come down, or are they just asking for the same thing all over again? Next slide. And then there is the other category of deviation from the regular regulation for air protection, which is the technical standards. And we talked about that in a previous webinar where 2 facilities in the sector can ask for a technical standard. And because of the way the rules have changed around granting these standards, there is less public consultation required and more ministerial discretion, unfortunately, but you can find information on companies that have received approval for a technical standard. Next slide. So for example, you can go to the technical standards registry that the Ministry of the Environment maintains, and you can search by the town or the area or the facility name as shown here, where the search was Sarnia. Next slide. And then you can see when you do that, the companies in the area that have received approval for a technical standard to apply to specific contaminant emissions. And remember, this is a deviation from the regular requirements of the air regulation in Ontario. So this is a concern to be keeping on top of this. Next slide. And you can see when they were approved and the registered contaminants. So in this case, a number of them were for benzene, and the registration date was 2017. Next slide. And then similarly, when you comment on this, now there isn't quite the same way to comment under an express posting on the environmental registry, but there is a requirement in the ministry's guidelines when it's reviewing technical standard, is the extent to which there has been reduction of offsite impacts, and what is the local input, and what are the demonstrations of best practices being reduced to reduce the concentrations of pollution and to limit offsite impacts. And also, what are they doing around technically feasible pollution control strategies? So as I said, good evidence that something's technically feasible is if the same company is already doing it somewhere else. So we will be encouraging people to pay attention to the fact that there's a review of the technical standards coming up right away, and to be sending communications and letters to the Ministry of the Environment and to the facilities about the concerns people have about these technical standards applying in the area. Don't wait until you see something on the environmental registry, because it might not be there in such a clear way as it was at the beginning. Next slide. When there are applications open for comment, then those are posted on the registry. So for example, here's one that's open right now for Suncor Energy with an environmental compliance approval for air, and it's open until June. So if you happen to click on that, you could find out more about that proposal and where to send comments. Next slide. And then this is the example I gave earlier about how it's actually quite straightforward. You click on that button in order to send your comments in, and then you also can ask to follow the notice so that you directly get a heads up when they make a decision and there's an update on the registry. Next slide. The other topic we wanted to cover today is the alerting systems. So there's Sarnia Lambton alerting system. It's a regional emergency notification tool. It covers a number of different types of emergencies, not just air emergencies, but it is relevant to air emergencies, and you can sign up for direct notice. And you can also go to the Blue Water Association for Safety, Environment and Sustainability website for more information. Next slide. And there's also guidance from Lambton County generally about various types of emergencies, and they do include chemical emergencies in their emergency plan as a relevant type of emergency, specific to Lambton County, including Sarnia area. Next slide. And if you go there, which I encourage you to do ahead of time, because you're not going to have time in an emergency to be reading a website, but go ahead of time and take a look at what it says on the various different kinds of guidance. We just pulled out a couple of examples of the guidance it provides. So for example, one thing you might be asked to do is to shelter in place, and it says why that might be better. And then they have more information than we have on this slide about what that means. There's a steps to take when sheltering in place that you can expand and find out more. I assume they have it on the website. I didn't double check, but for example, it's often important to turn off your air conditioning and ventilation system so you're not bringing in the outside air into the house. And it's often important to put damp towels around the bottoms of doorways and things for the same reason. Next slide. And then there's specific provision for schools and daycares with internal response procedures for shelter in place advisories, and specifically addresses the context of a chemical emergency or release. And they have some specific guidance again here, which you should read ahead of time, about things like whether you should pick the child up, making sure there's information about how to reach you, and specific instructions around evacuation and waiting for an update. On evacuation, I might add that sometimes it's not something that you should just do without guidance, because you don't want to inadvertently head into a plume of dangerous air emissions. Next slide. And then you can also contact the base's hotline at the local phone number. And then there are also safety sirens in various locations, and you should turn to the local radio station if you hear that siren, and you should know what the siren sounds like as well. And next slide. And so I think I'm going to turn it over to Matt, I think it is, to provide some closing remarks about overall the importance of reporting, why it matters, and how it's being shared locally.
So I wish I had the answers to all that, but I don't. I think I want to limit my remarks in this way. I think probably the people of Aamjiwnaang, or people, our close neighbors over the years have, I don't want to say we've given up on reporting, but I think that everyone who's probably likely to report all of the smells and the contaminants that we experience, they've probably done their fair share of reporting and probably haven't seen a lot of feedback. And I'll use myself as an example. Earlier this year, I left the band office at Aamjiwnaang. The smell's empowering. The smell was overpowering. I was lightheaded, dizzy, to the point where I got in my car and I had to sit for 5 minutes before I would drive. Obviously, I reported that, as a sweet smell, that perhaps something like a paint thinner, but much sweeter smell. I make that report, and I get an email back saying, "Thank you for your report." And that's kind of the end of the reporting. So I didn't get any follow-up with anybody. I haven't experienced any outcomes from that. I can look at the reports that circulate now and look at levels of benzene and other things on that day and try to line up for myself. But having said all that, we really can't give up. I think that people in industry would probably say if there's no reports, that means they're doing awesome. And I think that other option, which is people have stopped reporting, isn't a checkbox on that form. So I really think we do need to go back to reporting all that we can. Perhaps as a community, whoever that is, we should be getting together to find out how do we share that amongst each other. Whether what we are experiencing is the same as what others are experiencing. We probably need to try to build a community around that, to hold whomever accountable. The only thing I do want to say is some of the local industry does encourage us to call them when there's an issue. Because what I suspect is that their staff, who are present 24/7, could probably react quicker to our reports than anyone else. And if there really is a problem, I would expect or suspect that they're going to want to have their own employees with eyes and nose and ears on the issue and to try to address it. From what I hear through the grapevine, most of those reporting numbers are to the security, because security is there 24/7 at the front gate. And perhaps we'll work on a list of those phone numbers and get it added to the slide deck. So I think that's all I kind of want to say. And next steps is that we can't give up.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Matt. And yeah, so some of these are things we'll continue to do some digging before we're down for the in-person on May 30th. And for sure, yes, we'll add those phone numbers to the slide deck before we post it, so that these slide decks can become a good resource as well. And we'll probably, go through the 3 webinars and the slide decks and make a kind of a pithier little toolkit for people that they don't have to go find the slide deck and open it up and go through 30 slides and find that phone number. So hopefully that'll be helpful too. So with that, I'll turn it back to April to moderate if there's any discussion or any questions. And if there are any questions that we don't know the answers to, we'll also try to get those subsequently and share those answers if possible.
Great. Thank you very much, Teresa. Okay, so I'm just going to pause while we have Teresa's contact information up here. And then also, Zoe, if you can go to the last slide, just so people have our contact information. So you've got our info outline and also our website and our phone number. And at this point, I'm going to stop the recording so that we can move into discussion.